Hello and welcome back to Deck Doctor episode 3, and this time we're going to be covering a budget mid-range green deck for all you new players out there. This deck is easy to learn and it's quite linear. All you're going to do is build up towards the 2 Faeria wells, double collect, summon big creatures, and overpower your opponent. You have lots of buffs in this deck to make your bigger creatures even bigger, and even turn some of those smaller threats into formidable opponents. So let's move on to the cards and talk about each card that will be in this deck. First up, we have our primary Faeria gatherers and cards you might be looking for in your mulligan. Bone Collector is fantastic Faeria gatherer because he costs 1 forest 2 Faeria, which means you can summon him on turn 1 and you can start collecting for you on turn 2. Not only that, every creature that dies adjacent to it gives him +1/+1, which means he can grow into a big threat if he's not managed. So Bone Collector may start out as a Faeria Harvester, but with enough power-ups and enough +1/+1s from creatures dying around it, or it clearing creatures itself, this could move into an aggressive creature quite easily. A Wood Elemental is also a great Faeria Harvester, but also has the additional gift effect of producing an additional forest, and this synergizes with other cards in the deck, which we'll talk about later. Wood Elemental is the only taunt in the deck, so it will help against Rush, but is great for accelerating land and collecting Faeria. Faerian Golem is one of the big body creatures in this deck. He's a 5/10 for 5 Faeria, but costs 5 forests before you can summon him, which is why Wood Elemental has such good synergies in this deck. As a 5/10, he's going to be really hard to clear, especially if you invest some buffs into him as well. Red will struggle a lot with this creature, but he is vulnerable to hard removals and transforms from blue and yellow. But at 5 Faeria, you can't really go wrong for a 5/10. Verdant Force is one of the more aggressive creatures in this deck. 6 Faeria 7/7. He's going to be really help you finish off games, but also clear those popular 5/6 creatures across the colors. Ancient Herald, Ground Shakers are 2 examples. So Verdant Force is just a really solid 7/7 6 Faeria creature, which will help you fight on board, but also push that extra damage on your opponent's orb. Last but not least, we have Oak Father, which also has synergies with the Wood Elemental we talked about earlier. Every forest that you control, he gains +1 health, and he starts off as a 6/6. So this can easily grow into like a 6/10, a 6/12, which again, Red will really struggle with. But it's just a very durable creature which will stick to the board and be able to clear a lot of your opponent's threats. Elderwood Embrace is one of 2 events in this deck, and it's probably one of Green's best cards. For 3 Faeria, you can give a creature +2/+4. Now the health stat you gain from this card is incredible. It can turn smaller creatures into real tanks, but that +2 attack as well is definitely going to help you fight on board. Tiki Caretaker is very similar, but it gives you a creature as well which can act as a Faeria Harvester once it's used as effect, but you don't gain as much health as the Elderwood Embrace. But like I said, you can keep this as a Faeria Harvester in the back line, so it doubles up as something that gathers Faeria for you, but also a card that increases the power of your creatures. Oaklin is one of the crazy combo cards in this deck. Once it dies from its last word effects, you gain +5/+5 to a creature in hand, and has fantastic synergies with Feed the Forest, which we'll talk about very soon. But this card can really snowball a creature in your hand out of control. It can turn, say, an Oak Father into a giant threat. But most importantly, you want to hit stuff like the Tiki Caretaker, because then you get a 6/6 that gives a power up to your creatures. So I kind of like Oaklin hitting the smaller creatures because it empowers them even further and turns them into creatures that are worth 6 Faeria usually. But it's not too bad when it hits a giant creature and your opponent can't deal with it. Feed the Forest is green's primary economy card, and it will give you Faeria equal to a creature's health and draw you a card as well, and has its fantastic synergies with Oaklin, which we just talked about. But this card can be used on your other green creatures. Faeria Golem's a good target as well. You're going to gain 9 Faeria after you've paid for the Feed the Forest, and he only costs 5 himself, so that's a good burst of Faeria. Tiki Pipe is not a bad target as well if you're desperate for some Faeria. Grove Caller, which is on the side as well. This is a card, once it's used as effect, it usually just falls into the Faeria Harvester role, but with 4 health, and again, another great target for Feed the Forest. So this is a card that can get you back into the game if you're behind. That burst of Faeria, that extra card draw, will be what you need to summon another threat or another defender to stop your opponent. Tiki Piper is a bit like Tiki Caretaker, but doesn't give any attack stats, it only gives health. So this is a great way to make your creatures more durable, stick to the board, but Tiki Piper can also target itself, so keep that in mind. It's not a bad opener as a Faeria Collector on turn 1 because it only costs 1 forest, you get a 1/5, it's going to stick to the board and harvest that Faeria for you. Grove Caller is one of the crazy cards in this deck because you can teleport one of your creatures to a friendly forest. So if your Oak Father's up at the top of the board, you know, smashing that orb, and then your opponent summons a creature that can maybe set a threaten lethal against you, you can teleport the Oak Father back down to the other side of the board and then clear that creature. And there's loads of different things you can do with this card. Teleportation is a very powerful mobility trick and exclusive to green and yellow, but the Desert Twister costs a lot of deserts, whereas Grove Caller is a lot cheaper. So that covers the cards in the deck. Let's talk about the mulligan. Bone Collector, which I've already said is a great opener because you can play it on turn 1 and it can start harvesting Faeria for you early on. Wood Elemental is also really good, especially if you're on Explore, because you can explore forest into Wood Elemental, you gain that Harvester, but you also accelerate your land into that double well collection spot. Verdant Force isn't too bad, it isn't the best, but it means you can play it on turn 2, it costs 6 Faeria, and it's quite sturdy, you know, with 7 health it's going to be hard to remove in the early game, and then you can march it up the board and then fight your opponent's creatures. But there are some cards you could pick to support these harvesters if you get one in your opening hand. Elderwood Embrace is one of the best support cards in the game, so if you do get an early harvester, keeping Elderwood Embrace could be a great idea because you can bulk it up, it can clear other creatures, but also makes it more durable so it's less vulnerable to removal. Tiki Pipe is also a good keep, can again further extend the health of your creatures, but also can act as a harvester itself, so Tiki Pipe is not a bad keep, probably not ideal, but if you do get this card in your open hand, it might be worth it because it's guaranteeing you a Faeria Harvester in the early game. And again, Tiki Caretaker acts very similar to the Elderwood Embrace, but also gives you that additional Harvester as well. So now we talked about the mulligans, let's talk about the land placement. The land strategy with this deck is pretty simple. You just want to build forests into the wells and then stop your opponent from collecting from those wells or pushing up to be aggressive depending on if your opponent is playing a slower deck. So your lands will start out something like this. You'll build up to your first well, and then you'll make a decision based on what your opponent's playing. So if your opponent's, say, playing a control deck, you'll want to push up your lands quicker towards the second well, because then you can maybe squeeze another forest above the last forest at the top of that well there, and then you have an aggressive angle to go in on your opponent's orb. However, if your opponent is playing a mid-range deck, they're going to be wanting to achieve the same goal as you, so you're going to want to build lands into the wells to stop them from collecting there. Now, if you're playing against Rush, you build your lands completely differently, and there is a guide on the hub to build in lands against Rush specifically, so be sure to check that out if Rush is becoming a problem for you. But Green doesn't generally struggle that much against Rush just because their creatures have so much health and they're able to stick to the board for longer. So yeah, that's all you want to achieve with this deck. Build into the wells, collect the Faeria, and then eventually push up aggressively. So that wraps up episode 3 of Deck Doctor. Thank you very much for watching, and if you're a new player, I'd strongly recommend playing this list. It's cheap to craft, it only has commons and rares, so you don't have to worry about those epics or legendaries. And this deck will teach you important fundamentals such as creature combat, positioning, and collecting from the Faeria wells. Be sure to check out Deck Pilot to see how I play the deck, and maybe you can learn a few things. So thanks again, have a great day, and I'll see you again next time.